Okay, so we're going to talk about arrays. Um, Arrays are basically, let's say you have a list of things you want to store. And so you could create separate variables for each item that you have in your list. And maybe you're going to the grocery store and you're buying a list of items, right? And so you could call your variable item 1 and put an item from the grocery store in there. You could put a string in there. And then item 2 and an item from the grocery store, and item 3 and an item from the grocery store. But the thing about this is it makes it hard to access those variables because they're all separate. So in order to, to print off that list of items, you would have to print item 1 and item 2 and item 3 and item 4 and item 5. And if you had 50 items, that would be a real pain to write out all those variables. Now, I know you can copy the word item and you can just add the numbers to the end, but it's really a pain. It's hard to manipulate, it's hard to work with. So there's an easier way to do this, and it's called an array. And so if you know you're going to have the same data types, you're going to have a list of strings, or you're going to have a list of integers, or a list of decimal numbers, then you create an array. And you name that array based on whatever you're talking about. So if you're talking about items from the grocery store, you can call your array items. And then you can actually use what's called an index number. And so it starts numbering in 0, and then it goes 0, 1, 2, 3. And this is what we were talking about before. Arrays do start at 0, which is kind of unusual. But because they have an index number, it makes it easy to access them. So I could have a for loop because a for loop walks through something. And you know how many times you want to do something. So if I know that I have 10 items on my list, I can have my for loop go through all 10 items on my list. And then I can just print them off easily, because what will happen is you will just have it print one line and you'll just have it change the index number of what item you're on. And so instead of writing like these separate variables as item 1, item 2, item 3, we will have this array and the index number will switch for us. And there's really no way to do that if you're just using separate variables. Plus, you're taking up more space, in order to do that. And so it's not efficient. So it's not even, you're not able to access it, you're not able to work with it. But with an array, you can just put how many you have. So you put the data type. So just like before, is it a list of integers? Is it a list of decimal numbers, which will be double? Is it a string? Is it a Boolean list? Is it a char list? What type of list? And we're calling that list an array. We put what name we want to refer to it by, because we have to say, just like we name variables, we name the array. And then how many do we have? And so, for example, if we have 5 tasks, we would put a 5. And the little square brackets, that represents array. Okay, so what happens is you will set aside 5 spots for saving your values. And then it'll put, you can either, we'll talk about how to put the values in if you know them right away, as a list of numbers or a list of strings or whatever data type you're working with. Or we can go through a loop and have the user input the data into the array. And so there's all different ways to get the data in there. But you're just setting aside how many spaces you want to have. And so this number that we have here is called the size declarator. It tells how large the array is going to be, how many values you want to have. The only thing about an array, though, is it can't change size. Like you can go back up and change the initial size of it, but you can't later in your program make it grow. Like you can't have it start at 5 and then ask it to have 6 values later in your program. So based on the data type and the number of elements of values you're going to have, that'll determine how much size it's going to take up. Okay, so if you want to, and this sounds strange to do this, but as you see a full program, it'll make more sense. You can use your size declarator that tells you how large your array is going to be as an actual constant. And so remember, constant goes CONST for constant. And then you put that in here. And the reason for that is because you can, easily change that number. It's one spot. But also, when you're talking about your for loops and things that work with the array, instead of using the number, like let's say your array has 6, because this one says it has 6, you can have your for loop go through based on the number 6. And then you might have another for loop that works with array. Maybe one for loop is to get the data in and one is to print it out. Well, you have to put 6 there for both of those for loops. And if you change the number, if you go back up here and you change the number in your array to be 5 or to be 4, you have to remember to go back to your for loops and change those as well, or else it won't work, right? The way that it's supposed to work. So the nice thing is if you put a constant up here that says size, is 6. Then in your loop, you use size instead of using the number and size again. And then that way, when you change the size to be 4 or whatever number you want, it changes all the places that have size instead of having a number. And so when you see the full code, I'm hoping that'll make more sense. But it is common for people to do that for the arrays because it gives one place for changing the number. And then everywhere that you are referring to that number that deals with the array, that's how large the array is, will change based on that variable instead of having numbers throughout your program that you have to remember to go change because it's easy to forget. And I mentioned this before, and this is a strange thing, concept for people to get used to when they're first starting with arrays. Your index numbers or your subscript, index and subscript are the same thing, start at 0. And so that's kind of unusual because if I were counting the number of students in the room, I wouldn't start counting at 0. I would start 1, 2, 3, right? So arrays, because the way computers work, start counting at 0. And so we have to get used to that because if we start counting at 1, we're missing that first value. So we have to make our for loop start at 0 instead of starting at 1. And that's why you'll see some people, even when they're doing something that isn't dealing with an array, start using 0. Also, when you're talking about strings, each character in a string has an index value and it starts counting at 0 as well. And so it's common for people to start for loops at 0 because of strings and arrays, and every index number you're talking about, subscripts, start at 0. And so it makes it easier to deal with. Oops. Okay, so if you want to put a value into an array, because there's multiple places that value can go, as we talked about, where do you want to put the value? Okay, you have to say what index or what subscript number you're talking about. And so, for example, here, this says that you want to put the value 79 into the subscript 0 or index 0 of the test array. And so you would first create the test array, and then you would put the values in. And I'll show you different ways to do this because, of course, you don't have to, if you had 50, you don't have to go 0, 1, 2, 3, right? You can use a for loop to put values in if you were having it come in from the user. Or if you had a list of numbers, instead of doing them all, you can put them all in at one time. I'll show you how to do that as well, instead of doing each individual one like that. Kind of would take a long time to do that. But if you wanted to just change or add one value to the array, that would be how you do it. And if you wanted to, for example, print that value out, you would say the name of the array and you would put the actual subscript. You can't just write the name of the array and have it print the whole array, unfortunately. You would have to loop through to print each value. And I'll show you how to do that. But you can't just put the name of the array. So down here it says, you can't do this. You have to, because it doesn't know which one to print and it doesn't just print them all for you. It doesn't know how to format that or anything. So it doesn't loop through them for you and print them for you. So this one would print the first value in your array because 0 is the first value. And then this one, for example, the cin would take in a value and put it into the second value of the array because number 1 is actually the second value. You can do arithmetic with values of the array. Just remember that when you're accessing a value of the array, it's just like any other variable. So if you put the name of the array and you put the square brackets and what index number, it's just going to pull the value. And then you can do anything you would normally do with a value. So if you wanted to add 2 values together, you could do that. If you want to do any equation with them, if you want to do any condition with them, if you want to do an if statement with them, compare 2 values of the array, you could do that the same way you would do with any other value. Because once you pull the value, it's the same as any other value. And so you just put the name and you put the actual square brackets and the subscript or the index number. And then it pulls the value, and anything you would do with the value, whether you want to use it for a loop or you want to use it for a condition, or an arithmetic statement, you would do that the same way you would normally do that. And this one is just saying, pull this value, which is the first value in this array, and this value, which is the second value, add them together and put them into the 5th value of the array. So it's actually number 4, but it's the 5th because you start at 0. Does that make sense to everybody? Any questions so far? Good. Okay. So, and I'm going to show you various ways to do this, but this kind of gives you an idea of how this works. There's an easier way to do this, but it kind of lets you visualize what's going on. So this one is saying that you have this constant variable called num employees, which is 6. And that means that you're going to have an array of 6 places, 6 values to store your data. It's an integer array, so you can't put decimals in there. And then you're going to ask them for the information, how many hours did the employees work, okay? So when you enter it, you're going to enter each one, and the first one's going to go into the first value of the array, and the second, and the third, and the fourth, and the fifth, and the sixth. Notice how you only have up to subscript 5, but because you started with 0, there's actually 6 places to take in the data. So remember, you're always off by 1. So if you start counting at 0 and you had 6 values, you would actually stop at what would be called subscript or index 5. Because if you go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's actually 6 values. It's kind of weird to get used to. And that is going to teach us how the for loops work for it, because we have to know that we're actually stopping 1 before what we normally would if we start counting at 1. But this is not the most efficient way to do it, because there's an easier way. If you know you're just going through each number of the array, there's a for loop that we can use. And the for loop, when it changes and increments, it can actually just move through each one of these items, because what I just did is kind of like what I was talking about with that grocery list, because I have to go through each one. And if I'm having to do the name of it and put the number that it is, it's really not making it any better than if I named the variable hours, 0 or hours 1, and hours 2, because it's not making it easy to work with, because I should be able to use a loop to work with that. So this is just giving you the visual of what's going on. And then there's an easier way to do it. And then the same thing for the output. Right now, this is the longhand way, just to kind of visualize what's going on with the array. And then we're going to make it to a for loop, because that would be more efficient. Because this, it's easy to make mistakes. And if I had lots of values, that wouldn't be something that I would want to type a bunch of lines for. It'd be much easier. If I had 50, that would be very frustrating. So here, if you're just doing a printout, you say what index. Again, a for loop would be much easier to use in this case, but this is giving you a visual of the different index numbers of the array. And so here's the data going in. And so here would be the data in the array. The first one would be index location 0 or subscript 0. Index and subscript are the same thing. And so sometimes at your book might say subscript or index, or, they're both the same thing. Actually, element and value are the same thing too. So I'll try to switch that up. I'm talking about it. So the value is 20. It's going into the index 0, 12, and these are just the numbers that are typed here. So each one's going into here. Notice how it's 0 through 5. And then here you're just doing a C out statement that says them, and it's just going to print them back off. So it's going to print them. Going to print them back off. Is everybody following? So far, so good? Not too bad. Okay, so just like you can put a number here, you can put a variable that represents a number, because the variable is just a value, that's being pulled from the variable. So it doesn't matter if it's a value or if it's a variable that represents a value. So here I could have like an integer I, which is 5. And if I say that I want to pull test index I, that would be index 5, right? It would just pull whatever is in I. And what we're trying to do is trying to work up to the for loop that we're going to use to make life easier for us. But does that make sense to everybody? Perfect. All right, so here we have a loop. And so first we start off, we have our constant. And again, here, this describes why this would be useful. So instead of putting a 5 here to say that we have 5 numbers in our array, we put a variable that represents 5. And we make it a constant, because we're only going to use it one time to represent the size of the array. We're not going to change that number anywhere but here. We can't change it throughout our program. Okay, so when you're working with an array, you need to start your for loop at 0. You can name your for loop variable that moves through it whatever you want. Like this one's called count, but normally people call it I or index, but I for index, but count is fine. So count starts at 0. As long as count is less than whatever your size is. And notice how I didn't use 5 here. I have array size, which represents 5. And this makes it easier, because if I change this number here, then this number changes as well. I don't have to go change it. And if I'm doing multiple for loops, that means that it's less likely for me to make a mistake, because I won't forget to go change something later. And so this is going to be less than, not less than, equal to. And the reason is because we start at 0. So if you start at 0, you're going to be 1 more than you need. And so if you're going 6 values and you're doing, actually this one says 5. So if you're going 5 you would go 0 through 4. You wouldn't want to include 5 because that would go too far. Because if you actually count 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's actually 6, right? But if you do 0 through 4, that's actually 5. Does that make sense to everybody? So you're always going to start with 0, go less than whatever number of numbers you have in your array, and then increment by 1. The reason why you increment by 1 is because you want it to start 0, then go 1, 2, 3, count by 1s. So what this for loop is going to do, there's no curly braces, so it's just going to have this one line. It's going to put 99, it's going to assign the value of 99 into the numbers array, index location 0 the first time through. And then it's going to increment, and it's going to go to location 1, and it's going to put 99 in there. And then location 2 and put 99. So basically all 5 values that you have will be 99. By the time you're done, it'll just fill 99 in there. And so that's one way to do it, just with the same number. But I don't have to do each one. So far, so good? Okay, so we talked about this. It's important that you start at 0. If you are, I like to have this variable declared here, this count variable. But if you were going to use that count for some reason outside of your for loop, you would want to declare it before your for loop, and then you would be able to use it outside. Typically, we don't use those values that are moving through the loop outside of our for loop, but sometimes you may, so you can do that. But this one doesn't have it declared, so you have to make sure you declare it. But you want to start at 0, go less than the size of the array, and make sure you increment by 1s to access every value in the array. Okay, if you know your values ahead of time, and you're not getting the input from the user, you're just putting a bunch of values in there, you can actually put it in like this. This is called an initialization list. And so initialization just means giving values to the variable. So initialization list is giving these values to the array. And so you put here, what's the name of your array? And you put the curly braces here, those are curly braces, and you separate all your values with a comma. If you had strings, you would put quotes around them, separate them by a comma. But you put your values and you separate each one by a comma. Okay. Now, you need to make sure that you have the same number that you have here. Like if you have 5, you have 5. If you don't have enough numbers, like if you say you're gonna have 5, but you only have 3, it'll fill the rest in with 0. And so it's okay. But if you have too many, like if you say you're gonna have 5 and you put 6, C++ will actually not have, it won't stop the program, like it won't have a syntax error, which some other languages will. It'll just write that data as in the next memory location it can, but it won't really be able to access it the same way. So, and it will, because it's not allowing for 6 values, it's only allowing for 5. It could overwrite important data that you had already saved there because it wasn't expecting that value. And so we don't want to do that. Like we don't want to just go too far in the array because it can override important information that you had saved there. And so we want to make sure that we tell C++ how many values we're going to have. So it set aside the storage for that. It doesn't set aside the storage and then overwrite data that you already had in the other locations. So make sure that you're telling it the right size. Always account for more than what you might think you need if you aren't sure how much you need. This one is going to have a variable called months, which is 12. And what's going to happen is it's going to create an array with those 12 months. And so when you put the number of days that each month has in here, it's going to put them in. But the problem is that you're going to be off by 1 because, we don't start counting at month 0. We start counting at month 1. And so our for loop is going to start at 0 because we always start for loops at 0. And then we are going to go until less than how many months we have. So it does 12 and add 1 each time. But when we're printing, we could print month, but if we just put the count in here, it'll say month 0, right? And how many days it has. And so we wanted to say 1, but we don't actually want to change it to be 1. We just want to display it as 1. So if you want to just temporarily change it for display purposes, you can take the variable +1, but not put it back into the variable. Like if you say count +1, that adds 1 temporarily, but it doesn't actually change count. So it's not messing with my counter that's moving through my loop. It's just temporarily adding 1 to it. Okay. And then this will be the name of your array. So if you called your array days, this will be the name. And count will be whatever you are on in your loop. So if you're on 0, the first one will be the first value, which is 31. Then it'll increment to be 1, which will be 28, and then 2, which will be 31. And so it'll print them. But it won't say month 0 because I put count plus 1 here. Does that make sense already? Okay. All right, perfect. And I was talking about this before. So you have the values are put into the array. But if you say you're going to have 7 and you only put 4, for example, it's called a partial array initialization because it only gets part of the array filled in. So it'll fill in the values you gave it, but it'll give the rest 0. Okay. Now, if you are going to have 4 values, you actually can leave off the number here because C++ will determine the size based on how many numbers you have. You can put it there just to make sure. But if you're going to have a partial array filled in like this, you need to put it because if I didn't put it, it would think I just have 4 and it wouldn't leave space for the other 3. So if you only know 4 of the numbers and maybe you're going to fill in the rest later, you can do that. Just have the extra values, in case you need it. So 7, 4 would get filled in, 3 for later. Does that make sense to everybody? But if you only want 4, you can actually take the 7 off there. So this is what I was just talking about is if you only want 4 values, then you don't really have to put a number here because it's going to see how many values you want based on how many is on the list. But if you wanted extra, you need to put the number so it adds the extra. Okay. So it's optional. You can put it, it doesn't hurt anything, but it's optional if you're going to use that many numbers. We talked about this briefly. Some languages have what's called bounds checking. Bounds checking means that like if I try to go too far in an array, if my for loop, if instead of saying less than the size of the for loop, if I said less than equal to, what would happen is in another language, it would crash because it can't go that far. Like Java, for example, then what you take in the next course, it can't do that. But C++ will just pull the next value that it can in the next memory location. And so it might not be what you wanted because you didn't intend to have that many values, but it'll pull something for you. So C++ kind of makes up for some mistakes you do, but doesn't always do what you want because when it pulls values, that might not be what you wanted because you weren't supposed to go that far in the array. And so if you go too far in an array, C++ will just get you the next memory location, and it may not be what you want, but at least it doesn't crash, I guess. So, and if you try to put too many values into the array, then what'll happen is it'll just put it in the next memory location. So it won't crash on you, but you want to try to make sure that you're not doing that you're not going too far or not putting enough values in there. Okay. Does anyone have any questions on that? So some languages do that bounds checking and some don't, but C++, you don't have to worry about it crashing, but you have to make sure that you're not doing that because that's not something that, you don't want to be, you want to add more storage if you're needing an extra value. So add more to your array. Always go with too much as opposed to too little, because as I said, you can't really change it. Once you establish the array size, you can't really add extra in an efficient way because C++ will do it, but it's not really what you're supposed to do because it may not work the way you want it to work. So you want to make sure that if you need 6 values, you have 6, you don't have 5, and then just like access one that's not supposed to be part of the array. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna stop there. Oh, thank God.